Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some Path of Exile 2 discussion. Today, I wanted to summarize Grinding Gear Games' updated video that they put out, big changes in patch 0.1.1, but also to do a little bit of a deep dive into some of the consequences that some of these changes are going to have. There's a number of things that are touched on in here. For example, some of the Pinnacle bosses, definitely including the Arbiter of Ash, but potentially including the King of the Mists as well, and maybe the others. You're going to have more than one attempt at those bosses in the future. And that's going to have huge impacts across the Trade League economy. For example, I'm expecting that King in the Mist access tokens will go up and the belt ingenuity will go down as a result of this. So what I want to do here is go through this video with you and discuss the implications of each section as we get to it.
Now, later this week we'll be releasing POE 2 0.1.1. This is a patch designed to address the concerns that we can address relatively quickly, without needing to create a new league or a new economy just yet.
For Path of Exile 1 players, you'll know what it means to say without creating a new economy. But for Path of Exile 2 only players, what this means is that the most popular way to play Path of Exile 1, it's not the only way, but the most popular way, is to disregard the standard league and to play in the various temporary leagues that are set up and to start fresh every time a new league comes out. Typically leagues are about once every 3 months, although in the lead up to Path of Exile 2, they got slower than that. So they're more like once every 4 months, once every 4.5 months for a period. Now, when a new league comes out, most players will abandon their existing characters and start new ones in a new league. You'll be starting from nothing, you'll be starting level 1 on the beach, and so you've got to build up from nothing again. So what Jonathan is saying here is that 0.1.1 is not going to be one of these times that they encourage a fresh start and that lots of players take him up on that. Instead, it's going to continue with the same characters remaining playable and also all of the items that exist. Now, one thing that wasn't touched on is the various duplication exploits that existed around Temporalis. That wasn't discussed at all in this, and so unfortunately, there is not going to be a level playing field because those items that were created by cheating are still going to exist.
In this video, we'll be going over some of the issues we've identified and what we're planning on doing about them. It's worth stressing that just because a specific issue isn't on this list doesn't mean that we're not aware of it or that it isn't going to get addressed. It just means that we either can't fix the problem quickly or we can't do so without the need for a new economy.
This is an important point. There is not going to be a fix to energy shield versus life balance here because that's the sort of thing that they feel requires a new economy to happen. There is not going to be a nerf to Archmage because that's the sort of thing that they feel is only fair to do alongside a new economy.
One of the major areas that needs a lot of attention is the base experience of mapping. We've made a lot of changes here. First, in-game maps have received a balance pass to the number of monsters, number of chests, number of magical rare monsters, number of essences, strongboxes, and precursor artifacts.
Now, it's worth noting that Grinding Gear Games' intention here is that this is substantial. The maps have a big gap between the best and the worst ones at the moment, just in terms of the total number of monsters in them. And their intention is that the maps that people generally hate running, that there will be substantial improvements to those. It may not be in the form of a better layout. It may simply be in the form of additional monsters, additional magic monsters, additional rare monsters, something along these lines so that every map is the best at something.
You should generally find maps more rewarding than before. Maps generally specialize in one or more of these elements that they will be particularly rewarding in.
Of course, that's maps. And probably the biggest complaint a lot of people have had about maps has been towers.
Now, towers are a thing that's very important for players to run often, but we only had one of them. We wanted to add more variety here as soon as possible, so we've added 4 more tower maps. Alpine Ridge, Sinking Spire, Bluff, and Mesa.
I think this is going to be a substantial improvement. This is one of the changes I most wanted to see, is additional tower layouts. The current towers, the Lost Spires, I think it is, the one that's based on Torgul the Defiler's Zone, these are a miserable experience to run through. But when there are only 20% of your towers, I don't think they're going to feel quite as bad. People are still going to be sick of them because we've run a lot of them already, but they're going to feel a lot better with these changes.
We've also redone the existing Lost Towers map to make playing there less boring.
And of course, they have fixed up some things there as well, where they're just going to have a bit more open space in this zone and just removing some of those things that obscure line of sight in there.
We're now also spawning more maps with bosses. The rate was intended to be 1 in 4 maps, but in reality the rate was much lower due to some maps being unable to spawn bosses. We've increased the rate to compensate for this issue so that we can get the actually intended rate.
So what I think is happening here is that there's a number of map areas that were probably intended to have an Act 4, Act 5, or Act 6 boss in them, and that those didn't have a boss possible at all. And so now, with map bosses being more common, that's going to be a substantial upgrade, especially with one more thing that's going to boost the number of map bosses you'll get to fight, and that is these new precursor tablets.
We're also adding a new type of tablet that allows you to add bosses to your maps with its own mod pool.
So that's going to be pretty substantial, I think. That's going to make things feel a lot better for going and hunting down bosses on maps. Now we have the Strongbox changes.
Strongboxes also needed some love. They now spawn monsters faster, have a less annoying fog effect, and have also received changes to the timings and effects of the mods on them. Now, let's talk about visibility of effects. Many maps had too much clutter, preventing effects on the ground from rendering, causing you to be unable to see and dodge them. We've both changed the level of clutter on some maps, and changed some effects to make sure that they are always visible.
I think this is a really good change because one of the biggest problems you had was one-shots that felt like they were coming out of nowhere. Not even necessarily a one-shot, but something that chunked you really badly. With those things being more visible, then there's less of that unfairness feeling that comes up.
In addition, elemental explosion effects have had visibility improved. Stick around for longer before they explode, and disappear without exploding if a rare monster dies.
That last one is probably the most important there. The monster's effect will end up disappearing without exploding if the rare monster dies. That is going to be fantastic. Now, that does not apply to explicitly on-death effects, but the on-death effects are going to be much more visible as well.
Volatile plants are also way easy to see before they explode.
That needed it.
Now, we've also increased the zoom level on the Atlas, done a pass on various terrain collision issues in many maps. We've also improved the load times of opening the world map and Atlas panel.
Honestly, I think that last one about the load time is probably the most important of these quality of life adjacent issues here. That was something that was definitely really, really bad in the past.
And we also now show the biome of a map on the hover for it. For other in-game content systems, we're focusing on getting all the rewards in line with what they should be. For Delirium, we recently fixed a bug which caused Delirium monsters to just not spawn after the starting part. And we've also buffed the rate of simulacrums dropping by 20%, to make it more in line with the rate of finding the expedition and ritual bosses.
Now, that's an improvement. I still think that there's a lot of problems with how rare it is to encounter Pinnacle bosses. They've decided to go with an approach with Path of Exile 2, where each time that you encounter one of these bosses, the boss has a substantial amount of loot because the drop rates on the most powerful items from these bosses are quite high, but at the same time, it's also a lot of effort and a lot of time investment to get to them. For example, with Ritual, it seems like it's about 1 in 30 high-level maps that will give you an audience with the king. However, when you do run one, it's about 1 in 3 to get arguably one of the very best items in the game, Ingenuity, from the fight. So this is something that they've decided to keep this approach. What I would have rather see is much more access to these Pinnacle bosses, and then make it so that the drop rates on these items are lower, so that you still get the Ingenuity belt perhaps about once per 100 ritual encounters that you do in maps. But that's something that involves fighting the King in the Mist 10 times rather than 3.
For Ritual, we've made Omens now appear in the Ritual Tribute window 60% more often. For Expedition, we've improved the rarity from the shops, but we'll be wanting to make some more substantial changes to the rewards for this league later on.
Expedition's definitely in a fairly bad spot at the moment, and that's one of those mechanics that they just haven't got right yet. That said, starting with more mods on it is going to be a big deal. The next thing though is probably going to be the single biggest change here, and that's going to be the changes to Pinnacle bosses, and particularly the partial pullback from the you only get one shot at them. Now keep in mind that this is going to have major consequences to the Trade League economy. Let's have a look at what Jonathan's got to say first, then we'll discuss that.
Now, one of the major concerns that we're often seeing is that getting to play Pinnacle content just takes too long, and that when you do finally get there, you only get one attempt and don't get a chance to learn the boss. In order to address these concerns, we're making the following changes. First, we're making the Citadel spawn closer to the center of the Atlas, and we've also added an effect so you can see them in the fog of war from further away. This makes them much easier to find.
There are a couple of interesting things with these Citadels. So this is all talking about the precursor bosses that lead up to the Arbiter of Ash. These bosses, players perceive them to be rarer than they actually were. And also players perceived the ones that were based upon the Act 2 boss to be rarer than the other two. What was actually the case was that players were just not finding them because you'd get reasonably close, but you didn't path close enough to them that they were visible, and as a result, this new beacon system should make them much easier to find. On top of that, the Act 2 boss one wasn't any rarer than the others, but it was much harder to defeat, and so players were getting defeated by it, and that meant that there were far fewer of those fragments in circulation in trade across the entire of the economy.
To address the problem of only having one attempt, on the Arbiter of Ash you will now get up to 6 respawn attempts. Respawns can only be triggered by the person who put in the keys, and everyone in your party will be respawned at the same time. Leaving the map still forfeits your attempt, so you'll still need to fight the boss with the build you walked into the map with. Higher difficulties of the boss will lower the number of respawn attempts you get, but you should know the mechanics of the fight by then, right?
Okay, let's talk about the consequences of this. So, the higher difficulties, meaning that the boss is both tougher and also you get fewer attempts, is going to mean that most people are not going to be interested in running Arbiter of Ash +4, or they might do it once or twice early on with no intention of really going back to it. That's going to be a very important factor in the Trade League economy over time, because it's going to mean that the things that come only from the +4 versions of the bosses, which in general is not their best items, that sometimes is the case, but in most of them it's not. Most of the time their best items are actually available at +0. Then this is going to mean that the relative value in the economy of those +0 items is going to go down, the relative value of the +4s is going to go up, and also the access keys are going to get more expensive, not less. This is going to be because people who are running bosses are going to fail them less. I still think that most people are going to feel the need to use a carry service on these bosses. Grinding Games also clarified their intended time to kill on these bosses. Their intention is that it's 60 to 180 seconds that you're actually fighting the boss for properly. So that doesn't count any of the RP dialogue events that might happen before the boss or anything along those lines. That's just simply time spent fighting the boss itself. That's their intention when you first get to them. And then after that, you can become more powerful and get to the point that you can beat the boss quicker. I think we're still going to see a situation where people are going to feel compelled to get a carry service on their first time through these bosses. And this is why I would have preferred a package of changes whereby you simply got more access keys, like triple the number of access keys, but that the drops of unique items were about 3 times as rare. I think that would have created a situation where it didn't feel quite as bad to go in and find out that you were outmatched. So ultimately, I think they're solving the wrong problem when they're allowing the additional portals here. I think a lot of people will be happy with this early on, but the complaints that people have about access to these bosses being too expensive, these are going to stay the same or potentially even get worse because of these changes.
Now, we'll also be adding respawns to other Pinnacle content as well over time.
And they clarified on that they think that Zeshdula is going to be the hardest one to do it on, and that they're likely to be able to get it for King in the Mist straight away. Simulacrum probably straight away, and Olroth might be difficult as well.
Another thing that players have noticed is that there are less keys from Faradin Citadels on the market, and thought that it was because the Citadel spawns less often. It turns out though that this is just because the boss kills players more often than the others.
So there's a commentary on Jamana the Abomination in maps. It's worth noting that the major danger point here was the phase where he's between 85 and 65% health.
Changes to that boss to bring it in line with the other bosses.
They don't go into detail in that here, but basically the exploding corpses of the zombies that he spawns during the wind tunnel ability, that's where the real danger was.
People have reported that many of our unique items are feeling underwhelming. Uniques are often designed to be build enabling at high levels, even if they're low level uniques. But we realise that we do need to make sure that more uniques feel powerful when you first get them at low levels too.
So Jonathan mentions that in this patch they're going to buff a whole bunch of uniques. This is technically true, but in reality there is nothing here that jumps from I am definitely not going to use this if I get it at level to I am definitely going to use this if I get it at level. There are some that become a little bit better if you happen to have them already, but there's nothing that's being pushed to Goldrum tier. So none of these are going to be really, really strong leveling uniques. Instead, they're just going to be slightly better. It's like an extra small resist here, an extra attribute there, an extra single stat on most of these items. I don't think that this is going to make anyone think that uniques that weren't previously usable are now usable. You're just going to basically get 1 extra passive point worth of power, maybe 2 or 3, out of items if you were already using them.
We're also changing a few other things to make finding rares better at higher levels too. First, we're changing mod weightings a bit to make sure that there are less bad mods. Another fix is making high tier items no longer cull the highest tier modifier of a given mod type. This bug caused bows and crossbows to not spawn with attack speed at tier 5 rarity, and rings to not spawn with life at tier 5 rarity.
Okay, so that's one fix, but this is also going to mean that now you're going to be able to get light radius on a lot of these items too, which is going to be a negative for some of the tier 5 items as well. So this is a mixed bag. I think it's generally a positive change, but it is going to mean that some items are going to be worse. Ultimately, this is a case of light radius causing problems in the game. It's a stat that probably shouldn't exist.
Another change we're making is to make it so that socketables such as runes can now be overwritten with another socketable.
That's a huge improvement. That's something that allows people to fix their resistances with runes, which is something that's been needed for a while. No more will we be seeing people refusing to socket anything into an item until they've got the perfect soul core for it. Instead, you can put a rune in it now, and then later on you can get the right soul core if you're able to source that item.
Now, as we continue to play, we still find many balance anomalies with specific monsters or bosses that can be nasty if you encounter them. This patch contains a pass adjusting a large number of those monsters and bosses. We'll save the full list for the patch notes, but there are a significant number of changes here that should address many cases where monsters or bosses felt too hard in certain circumstances. Here are a few examples to get a taste of what kind of changes you can expect. The Silver Fist Commander roll now does a lot less damage. Plague Bearer's Detonate Dead can no longer be used from off-screen and has better telegraphing.
I think that telegraphing on that solves a lot of problems. That's something that's now pretty much fine, as long as the distance is right on it. I don't know what the distance is going to be. It feels like the sort of thing that if it has a 6 meter radius, it's fine. If it's more like 7.5 or 8, it's a bit more problematic.
Forsaken Miners throw less grenades, have improved visuals, and deal less damage. And Lost Men Zealots can no longer meteor you from off-screen either, as well as many other changes just like those.
So basically what they're looking for is the things that are causing one-shots on players, and they're nerfing them or they're making them more telegraphed so that they feel fundamentally fair. I think these are generally good changes.
One of the big issues for players on consoles is that the web-based item filter system is currently not working. This means that they can't use item filters like the PC users can. For 0.1.1, we'll be enabling the same system that POE 1 has, which allows you to subscribe to item filters on the website. For now, this will be done on the POE 1 website to allow us to get this feature out as fast as possible.
So this is a pretty good fix. It's not absolutely perfect. It would be good if console players had the full flexibility to do updates to their own loot filter the way that we do in PC world, but this is the next best thing. It's perfectly functional. PoE 1's filters are good enough on console without being perfect, and PoE 2 is going to be brought to feature parity with PoE 1 there. This is probably going to be the single biggest change here if you're a console player. For me though, as a PC player that hasn't owned a console literally since the Super Nintendo back in the 90s, this is not going to affect me, but I'm still happy to see these sorts of things getting fixed because they badly need it.
This patch also contains a bunch of other smaller changes and bug fixes that I'm sure you guys will appreciate, like buffing armor and scavenged plating.
It's worth noting that this buff to armor here is pretty small. People were wanting to see a substantial buff to armor. Granny Gear Games are looking more into solutions there. The way I think they're doing this is that I believe the formula currently has a factor of 12 in it, and the larger that this number is, the worse armor will be. In Path of Exile 1, they have this number be 5. I believe they're going to change it to 10. That's based upon the wording that Jonathan used in the live stream that was done afterwards, the Q&A. I believe that's what they're doing, but it's not absolutely clear. One of the key things that came up during that Q&A though, was that one of the things that makes armor feel so much worse in PoE 2 than in PoE 1, not just this numerical difference, but also the fact that in PoE 2, normal rarity monsters are just much more scary than they are in PoE 1. They can do a lot of damage sometimes. And that's one of the things with armor, is that armor just functions better against small hits than it does against large hits. So you're having a situation where you're often facing multiple medium-sized hits, and that's something that armor is not the strongest position to deal with, whereas evasion's really good when you're taking a whole barrage of medium-sized hits. In PoE 1, armor has one additional strength that it doesn't have in Path of Exile 2, and that is the synergies with Cast When Damage Taken and Molten Shell. Molten Shell provides an ablative buffer of essentially extra hit points. It's not quite guard, but it's kind of close to guard from Path of Exile 2. And this is something that's really strong. If you take a barrage of hits that would each deal 800 damage to you, your armor might only take the edge off that. It might only take the 800 down to 650. But then at the same time, you've got this additional ablative buffer of hit points that provides you with protection that will stop you from just dying to this barrage of hits. Then you can drink a life flask and you can get out of the way, or alternately, if it's something like porcupines with their on death effect, then you've successfully endured it. In Path of Exile 2, you take these small barrages of medium scale hits, but you don't have anything that really follows up along the lines of castle damage taken molten shell. And so you end up just falling over before you're out of trouble. That's something that I think Path of Exile 2 could consider, but that's new design space, and that's something that they can't really fit into a 0.1.1. Ultimately, I think Armor needs something that allows players to endure those barrages. It doesn't have it at the moment, and that's its biggest weakness. So that's one of the reasons that Armor feels so much worse than Evasion. Armor feels so much worse than Energy Shield because of a whole bunch of other reasons as well.
Showing the number of uses left in your charms, as well as an effect when they trigger.
The Song of the Exiles.
Fixing the music that Una was supposed to play in town. And plenty of other little fixes and improvements throughout the game. Now, we have a huge amount of much more meta-shifting changes that we know we want to make. And one of the best things about having the game in early access with the endgame is that we now have a much better idea of where we want character power to be and what the balance of bosses and monsters should be relative to that. But those types of changes are going to have to wait until we are ready to make a new league with a new economy for people to play in.
So that is the answer as to when the upcoming nerf to Archmage is going to be happening. That is not going to be happening until patch 0.2 most likely, which could be sometime in the future. They haven't committed to a release timeline for that, but it feels like from everything they're saying, it's going to be either late February, early March, or maybe even late March. So it's still a while off for 0.2. That's going to be when the new economy comes up. Anyways, I mentioned that there was also a substantial live stream question and answer session. I want to go through some of the key things that came up in that. Firstly, Grinding Games addressed the issue of accounts being hacked through trade. The precise details of what had happened are going to be written up over the next couple of days, but the short version is as follows. A Grinding Games administrator account was compromised, and after this had happened, 66 players' accounts were able to be logged into without any password being used. This was then used to facilitate all sorts of illicit trades that went on afterwards. More details were likely to come later, but that's the scale of the problem. 66 people's accounts were compromised. It is also possible that there were more that may have happened during the last days of November when there's no audit logs, but this would have been only POE 1 accounts. That's the short version of it. The long version of that will come out in a substantial write-up in the next couple of days. The second thing that came up was discussions around Magic Find. Now, I've always hated Magic Find in Path of Exile 1. I was really happy when in 3.25 they massively nerfed it. And then in Path of Exile 2, they went and added it back in, and they did so at levels that were even higher than probably the most extreme Magic Find Path of Exile 1 ever saw, which was Calandra League. Now, Jonathan confirmed that the increased item rarity diminishing returns formula that's used in Path of Exile 2 is in fact the same that was used in Path of Exile 1. This is a big deal because that was well known in Path of Exile 1. Essentially, items that say increased item rarity on them, they lie to you about how much rarity they give you. They give you less than they say they do, and the amount less that they give you is scaled based upon the amount of rarity you've got on your character. That said, it is still something that is overwhelmingly strong. Grinding Games are reassessing rarity at the moment. The reason that Calandra League had such bad loot in Path of Exile 1, the reason that Path of Exile 2 0.1.0 had felt like it had such bad loot early on, is because player loot is pre-nerfed to account for how good Magic Find stats are. As a result, players simply get less loot until they have a certain amount of Magic Find. Then beyond that, there's less of an effect of stacking more of it because of those diminishing returns. But ultimately, that is just the game lying to you. The game is telling you you've got 300% rarity when in actuality you might have 165% or whatever the exact formula is. Basically, everything about this stat is feel bad. Essentially, the impact of Magic Find is that it confiscates loot from people that don't have it, and it transfers that loot to people that do have it. Hopefully it goes entirely, but at least Grinding Games did say they are considering making substantial changes there. A number of questions came up related to the warrior class and mace skills, and the way that it can feel like it's working fine all the way through the campaign and into white maps, then it falls off really, really badly in yellow and red maps. But then once you get through that, it can then become an absolute boss-deleting monster at the highest gear levels. And so there's an intention to work on solutions to that, but that's not likely to come up until patch 0.2. The next topic was the section I re-recorded the most in this video, and this was discussing the question of death penalties. There's a number of things in Path of Exile 2 where deaths can feel pretty severe at endgame. So we're going to be focusing solely on softcore game rule set because people that opt into hardcore, they've chosen for that extra difficulty. And as a result, they're not going to end up getting any nerfs to the death penalty there. That would be undoing their agency to play that harder game mode. But in softcore, there's a number of things that are different to Path of Exile 1 when it comes to character deaths and how they play out at endgame. So let's just quickly recap the way that Path of Exile 1's death penalty works, because I think there's something important to go through there. And I'm not talking about the endgame death penalty here, I'm talking about during the campaign. Let's say that you're fighting Innocence, you're character level 44, and you go in and you're not able to work out the mechanics of the boss at all. You've just got no idea what's going on. You just do some damage, then you die. You go back in after you respawn, you do some more damage, you die again. You keep doing this, you'll eventually defeat that boss. It's going to be a pretty miserable experience. It might or might not teach you the mechanics of the fight. But the key thing is that you're going to eventually get past it if you throw enough corpses at the boss. That, I think, is what they want to really try and bend hard against with the Path of Exile 2 design. Now in Path of Exile 1, the death penalties become more severe as you get into endgame, but they never get as high as they are in PoE 2. Let's contrast this experience to Path of Exile 2. If you're stuck on a particular campaign boss, let's say it's Doriani in Act 3, you're trying to work out Doriani's moves, and you just find that you're getting a bunch of damage in, but then eventually you're falling over because you're making a mistake and you're going splat. Here you've got a couple of options. You can either learn more about the fight, or alternately, you can gear up. These are your two main options. It's not really possible to just bypass the fight. The way that you can with Innocence in PoE 1, where you can go, all right, you know what, I'm just going to power through this by throwing a whole bunch of corpses at the boss. Because every time you start Doriani again, the fight resets. So this is the way that it works in the campaign. You can see how it's more severe in PoE 2 than it was in PoE 1. The core goal that they're going for here, though, is that you can't bite off more than you can chew. If you are not yet strong enough to defeat Doriani, then you're going to need to get stronger to get past Doriani. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get past Doriani and then fight even more difficult bosses later in the game. Contrast this to Endgame. In Endgame in Path of Exile 1, you have 6 portals in each map, and every time you die, you lose a chunk of XP. In Path of Exile 2, you only get the one portal to a map. So you go in there, when you die, you lose the entire map instance, you lose any particular league mechanics that might have been there. So if there was a breach, if there was a ritual encounter, if there was a map boss, all that stuff goes away, but you might still feel you need to attempt that map again. And when you attempt the map again, you'll need to put a new waystone into the map device. So you'll need to spend an extra waystone to do so. And on top of that, you'll still lose XP, and the XP loss can feel more punishing than it did in PoE 1 because XP comes along slower in this game. Let's talk about the consequences of this. The more severe the death penalty is, the more the game encourages you to turtle up, play very defensively, and to move at a slow, methodical pace. That's the way that people play if they're running the optional hardcore rule set. Flip side of this is that the less the death penalty is, and especially as it approaches 0, the more the game incentivizes you to go as fast as possible and to basically completely disregard any character defenses, completely disregard anything other than just moving through the map as quickly as you can, looting everything that drops, and if you die, well, just get back in as quickly as you can. You see that a bit in Path of Exile 1. The most extreme it's ever been was the 3.7 era of the game with the delve meta, the 0 hit point meta, but I assume a lot of people won't be familiar with that. It's more the case, though, that at the start of a new league in Path of Exile 1, a lot of people rush into red maps before their character is even really good at yellow maps yet. You're still in a situation where you would die quite a bit in yellow maps, but you're able to push into red maps because you can get access to them, and you can push up to the top tier maps really quickly as a result, and sort of skip over a lot of that middle of the end game, and then fill out all of the rewards from that later on. So Path of Exile 2 wanted to try and prevent that. So one of the things that comes out of this is that if you're dying more than 5-10% of the time in maps, you're going to find that you start under-sustaining waystones. You're not able to continue progressing upwards, and so the game is telling you at that point. It's kind of like the situation where you just can't get past Doriani. The game is telling you, right, you are not yet ready for tier 12 waystones. Go run some more tier 10s, make your character stronger. Once you're ready, then you won't be dying so often in tier 12s, and at that point, you'll be able to push on. So that's the intention. They've identified several different levers for death penalties. So there's 1 portal versus 6 portals. There's the questions of XP loss on death. There's the questions of loss of mechanics on death. And all of these are being individually considered, but there's nothing to be announced as yet. Ultimately, I feel like once they deal with some of the worst of the one-shots in the game, I want to see what 1 portal feels like then. At that point, I'm open to it going either way. I'm open to it being better or worse than the 6 portal system in Path of Exile 1. The one thing though that I will say is that the 6 portal system in Path of Exile 1 does cause a lot of problems because it means that glass cannon builds can be viable. And when glass cannon builds can be viable, they're often something that is so strong that they can feel forced to anyone that's optimization focused. I don't want to see Path of Exile 2 get to the point where the path of least resistance to acquiring 100 divines in Trade League is to play a glass cannon build for many, many hours. I would rather it instead be a case that that's just an option for people that like that playstyle. It might be the best option for someone with the mechanical play skill of someone like Ben or Jung Roan, but for ordinary people, it's not going to be a smart choice. It's just going to be a choice that you can make if you like that playstyle. Otherwise, you're probably better off building a balanced character. I think balanced characters tend to be by far the most fun, and so whatever system they go with when it comes to death penalties, it should reward building a balanced character rather than pushing towards a hyper tanky or a hyper squishy character. That was the last of the major individual topics, so now we're going to go through some of the minor topics all in one bunch. Now, Chaos Inoculation is currently immune to bleed in Path of Exile 2. This is not intended. Bleed is not working the intended way. The way that it works currently is that if you don't suffer hit point damage to an attack, so actual loss of life rather than loss of energy shield, then you don't end up being affected by bleeds from it. This is not intended, and bleed is meant to be something that is fairly nasty for energy shield builds, so expect some changes there. That is actually considered a bug by Grinding Gear Games at the moment. What's the intention with the 7th and 8th ascendancy points? Are they meant to be a major endgame milestone? Are they meant to be something that you get reasonably early in endgame like they are in Path of Exile 1? And the intention is that it's substantially harder than it is in Path of Exile 1. That it's somewhat of a milestone that feels really substantial when you get there. I think in that case, they've probably got it about right. Kind of like it was in patch 2.2 of Path of Exile 1. A lot of people didn't play back then, but at that point, the 4th Labyrinth was very difficult to beat, and it was quite common for people to seek out carry services. Of course, one of the things that's happened since then is there's a lot more professionalization of endgame carry services in general, and that's something that is going to definitely be the case. For a lot of people, getting your 4th Ascendancy is not going to be about powering up your character enough to beat it yourself. It's going to be about buying a carry service for it. That's going to be the path of least resistance for most players while it stays at the current difficulty. That wasn't really discussed in the Q&A, so I'm curious to see what Grinding Gear Games think about that. There was also some discussion about adding new map clear conditions, not just kill every single rare monster. This is something that Jonathan was very clear they have to get right. If they add in an awful new condition, then it's going to feel terrible, and they want to give some thought to that. They also aren't very happy with the status of the core Atlas passive tree, the 30 points that you get. They don't think that this is working all that well, and they're not that happy with the progression, the way that you earn points in it. They feel that it's too grindy and not interesting and dynamic enough. And one of the last changes is that they are intending to add a map tab very soon. They had wanted to have it for the original release. It wasn't ready for the original release, but it is something that is going to be planned to be done very soon. The final part of the Q&A was a rapid fire section, which started off with questions about minions and then generalized onto other things. What's Grinding Gear Games' attitude to the fact that currently if the player suffers a slow, so do all of their minions? This is a bug and it will be fixed in the short term. What about Raise Spectre, or Bind Spectre, I think it's going to be called in POE 2? Is this going to exist? The answer is it's still a while off because they've got to remove dialogue from monsters, they've got to remove loud idle noises, a whole bunch of things like that. as well as just make sure that various mechanics don't explode the game in various ways when they're found on monsters. Will there be a search feature added to the Atlas? Yes, possibly in 0.1.1, but if not, soon after. What's happening to that pesky bird in Ultimatum? It's going to be nerfed so that it's no longer such an outlier, so much more dangerous than everything else in the game. What about rare monster visibility? There are going to be incoming changes, but they will not be a glow. Jonathan does not seem to like glow effects in games. Will we be able to salvage flasks with quality for baubles? Possibly in the future, not immediately. Will there be checkpoints in maps for fast travel around them? This is a maybe. This is going to be a fair bit of work to implement, but it's something that they can see the use for. Will there be an ability to change your quest choices for the Venom drafts? Yes, this is likely to come eventually. What about movement speed on boots? How do grinding gear games feel about the fact that it's considered to be a mandatory mod by players? They're actually quite okay with that. I don't agree with this. I think that movement speed's in a terrible spot. Basically, in my opinion, any boots that drop without movement speed may as well just be auto-deleted by the game. There's no real point for them to exist. Now, it's a bit different if you get something that's got a couple of really good mods. Say you get 4 mods and 1 prefix, 3 suffixes on the boots, and they're really, really good. Then you can exalt it hoping to get movement speed. That would be something that could potentially make those boots usable, but ultimately that's the only thing that's going to fix them, is getting movement speed on them. If they don't have movement speed as an explicit, they may as well not exist. This is even worse than some of the issues Magic Find has. The only reason it's not quite as bad as Magic Find is that it's only in 1 slot. There are a series of questions that can all be bounced down to one thing, which is what's Grinding Gear Games' attitude to the current state of crafting and the level to which people can deterministically create or not deterministically create various items. And their approach there was that they're basically pretty content with the status quo, subject to the fact that it's going to expand over time as new mechanics get added, each of which will have its own aspects of crafting that it will interact with. I think what they're trying to avoid here is what happens in Path of Exile 1, where people consider ground loot to be ground clutter, unless it is either a consumable item or it has something extraordinary that's an RNG drop that you can't otherwise replicate, you can't create through currency. For example, you might find a 29 or 30 quality Twilight Regalia. That's something that's genuinely loot in Path of Exile 1 because it cannot be made through crafting. But if it was just a 20 quality one, it would not be considered loot because you could just pick up a normal one of that same item, apply a Scouring Orb, and apply a couple of Armorer's Scraps, and you've just replicated that item using nothing of value. I think their goal here is that they want items that drop off the ground, rare items that come from monsters, to have at least a chance to be good for a long period of time. And at the moment, I think they've pretty much succeeded at this. Like the tier 5, tier 4 rarity system, there's a couple of issues with it, a couple of teething problems, but those higher tier rare items are basically always worth picking up unless the base that they're on is terrible, absolutely terrible, and something that could never be good at all. However, anytime that they buff crafting in any way, they are nerfing the value of these items on the ground, because what crafting does is it allows you to obsolete those ground items by making something better than them. And they're trying to find the right balance here, which I think is going to take quite a while to get exactly right, but ultimately it's in a different place to where it is in POE 1. I think POE 1 is still going to be the game that you go into if you want to have basically an item editor in game. That's what Path of Exile 1's quite complicated crafting systems all combine to provide. Path of Exile 2, ground loot will not be obsoleted by things that are produced by an item editor, and that's the core difference there. Of course, there is top-end crafting in Path of Exile 2, but it's currently very tied to omens, which I don't think Grinding Gear Games is particularly happy with them being the only source of top-end crafting, and I definitely agree with that. I think it should be more sources. Like ultimately, maybe omens shouldn't just be ritual. Maybe the best ones should be one from each of a bunch of different mechanics. I don't have necessarily the solutions there, but that's basically a summary of what they were saying, including a little bit of reading between the lines as to why Grinding Gear Games were saying things. And finally, what's the status of microtransactions that are being ported over from POE 1? So this is Cosmetic MTX. They're currently behind schedule on these due to lighting being more complex than they thought. So they're intending to bring them still across. All of them will be brought across before the game goes into full release. But this is something that they are behind schedule on. It's taken longer than they thought. Anyways, that's a summary of what to expect in 0.1.1 when it comes live later this week. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.